Chapter 047 Politics. Sitting alone in the train's compartment, Zorian stared through the window at the passing landscape, lost in thought and not really paying attention to what he was looking at. He was supposed to have disembarked already, but the events that had happened at the end of the previous restart were still at the forefront of his mind, and he figured it was best to delay his plans for a few hours until he was less distracted. It wasn't like he had some tight schedule to follow this early into the restart. Closing his eyes for a second, he searched his soul for the marker switch he had used to escape Sadamir and immersed himself in the impressions it gave him whenever he connected to it. The switch in question did not announce its purpose in words, but it made itself understood anyway. It was the abrupt end of everything, followed by a return to the beginning. Revert to starting point. That was what the switch claimed its function was, and, as far as Zorian could tell, that is exactly what it had done when he'd used it at the end of the previous restart. He had a way to end the current restart at whim. He could start over at any time without leaving behind a soul that could be interrogated and messed with. Hell, he wouldn't be leaving behind anything. The world would end on his command. All it took was pressing a switch. That changed everything. Necromancy, in many ways his worst enemy, was suddenly a lot less dangerous and frightening. The risk of having his suicide rings taken away or negated by fancy wards also became a lot less worrisome. The marker was virtually impossible to detect or take away from him. Many ideas he had previously dismissed on the grounds that they were too dangerous to attempt, such as exploring Yaskul Mansion or pissing off Kotachichul by aggressively going after Ibisan forces, were suddenly back on the table. Getting killed or knocked out before he could react was still a danger, though, as was the possibility of being drugged into submission. He wondered if he could set up some sort of contingency to trigger the revert switch automatically upon his death. It would require delving deeper into soul magic, but that may be a smart thing to do anyway, and eliminating one of his major remaining weaknesses was no small feat. A possible issue was that the revert switch might affect Zack and Red Robe as well, not just him. Was their restart cut short as a consequence of his action in the previous restart? Probably. It must have been, if the switch worked like he thought it did. There was a chance they'd failed to note the abrupt end, since he'd activated the revert switch very close to the time it usually ended at anyway. But since he intended to keep using the revert switch, that wasn't going to last very long. It didn't really matter, though, even if they had noticed. Both Zack and Red Robe had already known there were at least two other time travelers in the time loop, so this told them nothing particularly important. Well, it might come as a bit of a shock to Zack, since he'd never had his restart cut short like that, but whatever. He could now experience what it was like for Zorian when the other boy went around fighting dragons and whatnot. Opening his eyes, Zorian withdrew from the marker and refocused his attention on the passing landscape for a bit. It did not hold his attention for long before his mind drifted back to the events of the previous restart. Truthfully, he hadn't expected his gate exploration initiative to be as successful as it ended up being. He had expected to face better and more numerous defenses on the Seorian side of the gate, and once he managed to step through it, he expected to emerge into another heavily guarded Ibisan base. He hadn't expected to live long once on the other side. In fact, it honestly would not have surprised him if he had died before ever reaching the gate itself, never mind actually accomplishing much on the other side. The first try had been primarily about testing the Ibisan defenses to see what he was dealing with. Well, apparently he had been far too modest in his ambitions. He got everything he had been hoping for, and more. Now that he knew just how undermanned and unprofessional the defense of the gate was, and that there were no Ibisan reinforcements on the other side to come to their aid, he could afford to be a lot more direct in future attempts. Bringing a small army of golems and wiping out every defender so he could study the gate at his leisure actually seemed like a viable option. Granted, he would have to do it without giving the defenders a chance to summon Kotachichul, but it seemed doable. As a bonus, said golems would be heaven-sent against the hordes of undead infesting Yaskul Mansion. They were just as tireless as the living dead, and had no souls for the necromancer to mess with. Of course, it was impossible to think about Yaskul Mansion without automatically considering that final confrontation he'd had with Sadamir Kandre at the end, and that soured Zorian's feeling of success somewhat. He got out of the situation unscathed in the end, but the fact was, he got thoroughly outplayed and backed into a corner by a dangerous necromancer and had to rely on an untested ability to escape from his clutches. That wasn't the way Zorian wanted his conflicts to go. To be fair, though, the situation might not have been as bad as it looked. The restart was nearing its end by that point, so perhaps he could have stalled the man long enough to avoid any serious consequences. Failing that, he could have thrown a maximized fireball at his feet and hoped that reducing his body to fine ash interfered with Sadamir's ability to snare his soul. It was hard to know how dangerous the situation truly had been without knowing more about Sadamir's personality, or the limits of his necromancy skills. Well, he was going to find out more about the man very soon. For one thing, Sadamir was the mayor of Nyazovtveri, and therefore a public figure. There should be lots of information available about him, in both official and unofficial sources. For another, Zorian intended to keep attacking the gate beneath Sioria and exploring Yasku Mansion at the end of every future restart. There was no reason to pass up on that, really. The defenses of the gate were sufficiently flimsy that it wouldn't eat much into his schedule to organize an assault at the end of the month, and the revert switch made the idea of exploring a necromancer's lair a lot less crazy than it was up until recently. He definitely had to do something about the wards on the place, though. Sadamir seemed to have placed some very sophisticated stuff on Yasku Mansion, and Zorian didn't feel comfortable just ignoring them. Who knows what kind of exotic, forbidden stuff a necromancer like Sadamir wove into his warding scheme. Maybe he could avoid triggering the wards at all? If he could find some way to pass the initial authorization test upon stepping through the gate, the wards should stay dormant. There had to be a keystone or some such that let people pass through unmolested. There was no way Sadamir keyed in every individual Ebeson into the damn ward scheme. After some thought, he decided that such a bypass would be useful, but would likely just delay the problem. If it was Zorian in Sadamir's place, he would have definitely placed further tripwires around the mansion to foil such abuse. Considering how much Sadamir relied on his wards to deal with intruders, he was bound to have thought of that and more. He was wrenched out of his musings by the voice of the station announcer, who informed him that the train was soon going to arrive to its next destination. Deciding he had delayed things a bit too much as it was, Zorian grabbed his luggage and went off in search of an exit. It was time to visit the Iranian colonies again. Break. The last time Zorian had tried to get instructions from the luminous advocates, the result was a frustrating negotiation process that had lasted for nearly 3 weeks and had consumed the entirety of his funds in exchange for useful, but decidedly non-critical knowledge. The one thing he had needed back then, they had been unwilling to teach him. Consequently, he had stopped bothering with them. Especially since he had since found other, much more reasonable webs to trade with. The situation had changed, however. He was a lot better at mind magic now, so they should hopefully look down on him a lot less. He was also in a much better position to satisfy their assorted demands, thanks to the discovery of the Iranian treasury back in Sioria and the ability to steal money and resources from the cult of the World Dragon by raiding their caches. Finally, after getting taught about Iranian culture and customs from Voice of Peace, he had come to a conclusion that he had likely bungled his previous interaction with luminous advocates somewhat. He had come off as impatient and disrespectful, which probably had a lot to do with them dragging the negotiations out for several weeks. It was both the means of pressuring him into giving them greater concessions and a way of getting back at him for a perceived slight. That was why, when Zorian went off to meet with the luminous advocates on the first day of the restart, he didn't offer a trade proposal. Instead, he simply introduced himself and asked for a meeting sometime in the future. He was told to come back in 2 days. He did just that, at which point he presented the luminous advocates with a gift and spent several hours pretending he'd just dropped by to have a friendly chat with them instead of anything serious. Only then did he present his offer, starting with a very ambitious plan where he offered a lot and demanded just as much. They refused, of course, making a counter-offer that was ridiculously more in their favor, and so the negotiations began. It took them an entire week and a half to agree on a deal in the end, which was slow and annoying, but still a lot better than before. The agreement, much like the one he'd had with the filigree sages in the previous restart, went beyond his primary goal of learning how to repair memory packets and also encompassed refinement of his basic telepathy skills, practice of mental combat techniques, and further development of his ability to tap into and interpret Iranian senses. The last one was not something the Luminous advocates had any real experience with, by their own admission, but they were willing to lend him their considerable expertise on the topic. In fact, that was the part of the deal they seemed most excited about. Of course, Zorian didn't spend said week and a half idling around while the Luminous advocates dragged their feet. He spent most of that time scouting out other Iranian webs to see what they were able and willing to offer him. He visited the Talisman Bearers, Ghost Serpent Acolytes and Silent Doorway Adepts, the three shady webs that the illustrious gem collectors had informed him about back when he'd first sought other Iranian webs to learn from. Back then he didn't feel safe dealing with them, but his skills at shielding his mind had grown considerably since then. He also toured the 7 webs in the vicinity of Cioria that he'd found out about from the filigree sages, the Burning Apex, Red Brand Bearers, Deep Blue, Crystal Torches, Indestructible Silver Order, Stone Revelation Chanters and Riddles of Opening. All of them were interesting in their own way, but none of them could really help him with his memory packet repairing problem better than the Luminous advocates could. The Talisman Bearers were a magic-focused web, the most heavily magic-focused one that Zorian had ever encountered, and were thus a bad choice to go to when dealing with a relatively exotic mind magic issue like his. Still, visiting them had not been a waste of time in the slightest. Out of curiosity, he had bought several of the metal discs they used for their spellcasting to see how they worked. The spell formula designs etched into the discs blew him away, subjected to size and scarcity restrictions largely foreign to human spellcasting communities. The Talisman Bearers focused on squeezing in as many spells as they possibly could onto their primary spellcasting tool. The design was complex and incredibly dense, but it worked smoothly and efficiently, without the destructive resonances and disruptions that usually plagued such highly compressed spell formula constructs. The discs were useless to Zorian in their natural state. He wasn't an Aranya, and these tools were very much intended for Iranian use. Still, they were sufficiently similar to human spell formula that he could learn a lot from studying them. Considering how much he relied on items, any advantage in that area was noteworthy. The Ghost Serpent Acolytes refused to see him. Apparently their god guardian spirit told them he was bad news and that they should tell him to get lost. He had no idea what that was about, but it automatically made the web a lot more interesting than he expected. What did the spirit know about Zorian that pissed it off so much? He left the Ghost Serpent Acolytes alone for now, but he made a mental note to visit the web again in the next restart, before doing anything else, to see if they reacted the same way. The Silent Doorway Adepts were another surprise, because the doorway in their name came from the Bracora Gate around which they built their settlement. That was very interesting. They got really uncomfortable when he started asking questions about it, too, blatantly trying to change the subject. They claimed the gate mystified them as much as it mystified humans, but Zorian wasn't sure he believed that. There was definitely a story there, and their web was famous for having some kind of secret magic that allowed them to get into places. Still, it was obvious he wouldn't be getting anything out of them on the topic, so he politely backed off and moved on to other topics. Sadly, they had no interest in teaching him things. They pointed him back towards some of the webs he'd already known about, such as the Luminous Advocates, and that was that. That was not to say they were not interested in trade, though, they very much were. They showed passing interest in most of the stuff he offered, but what really caught their attention was crystallized mana. They really wanted crystallized mana for some reason. They were willing to take all of it off his hands, if he was willing, or as much as he could spare otherwise. In exchange, they offered a wide variety of magical items and tomes, all clearly of human origin, and many of them very much illegal. They also offered to put him in contact with some of their human trade partners, in case he wanted something they currently lacked. They also admitted, after some prodding, that they could provide him with information about other Iranian webs, where they could be found, what they were famous for, and what their weaknesses were. They warned him, however, that they would cut all ties with him if he misused such information. After some thought, Zorian asked them about alternatives to the luminous advocates when it came to mind magic specialists, agreeing to their price for such information. After a few hours, the representative returned with the information in question, giving him the names and locations for about 8 more webs that were notable for their mind magic mastery. He thanked them for the information and left. The 7 webs around Ceoria all had some things in common. For one, they were all very friendly to humans and a lot easier to talk to than any of the other webs he had been interacting with recently. For another, they were all magic-focused webs. Ceoria was the epicenter of the Iranian magical revolution, and all nearby webs had adapted to take advantage of that in some fashion. Finally, they were a lot more hostile to their neighbors than the other webs he had spoken with. The Burning Apex, Red Brand Bearers, Crystal Torches and Indestructible Silver Order all tried to hire him to attack their neighbors, and the Burning Apex outright stated that they intended to massacre the entire riddles of Opening Web whenever they got the chance, down to the last male and child. Oh, and all of them were very interested in any information about the Ceorian webs and any possible weaknesses they might have. Zorian suddenly understood why Spear of Resolve had been so worried about her neighbors and wanted to get humans on her side. Thankfully, none of the webs actually insisted that he had to help fight their battles, and were happy enough to engage in more peaceful forms of trade. Naturally, Zorian was primarily interested in mind magic instruction. The local groups, although primarily magic-focused, did have decent grasp of their innate mind magic, especially when it came to telepathic combat. Most of them were fine in tutoring him in their abilities, although the Stone Revelation Chanters and Indestructible Silver Order required a higher level of commitment than he was able to spare in this particular restart. In addition, most of them also traded in exotic alchemical ingredients gathered in the deep dungeon, some of which were impossible to acquire on the open market. Unfortunately, it was impossible to hide from a bunch of natural mind readers that he had contacted other Arania groups in the area while receiving tutoring in mind magic from them, so he could only get instruction from one of the local webs. Most of them didn't care if he was also receiving instruction from the Luminous Advocates, though, except for the Crystal Torches, who refused to teach him anything if they weren't the only ones teaching him. He chose Deep Blue in the end, because they were one of the 3 major webs in the area and struck him as the most peaceful of the lot. Also, Deep Blue mind magic specialized in dominating and manipulating the various monstrous denizens of the dungeon. Zorian figured their methods of dealing with creatures very different from themselves might also be useful in his quest to understand the Iranian mind. And if not, well, being more effective at hurting and neutralizing magical creatures was still a pretty useful skill to have. Thus, he'd secured himself 2 tutorships from 2 different Arania groups for the restart. The Luminous Advocates complained, questioning the usefulness of a web like Deep Blue when he'd already secured the services of the best, but Zorian couldn't help but notice that they got rather more motivated in their teaching ever since he'd done that. Trying to arrange for a 3rd group of Iranian teachers would definitely be a mistake, though. Best not be too greedy. Break. Not much happened until the very end of the restart. He dutifully kept learning mind magic from the Luminous Advocates and Deep Blue, and when he wasn't doing that, he was advancing his studies and other magical disciplines and preparing things for the upcoming gate assault at the end of the restart. He was rapidly going through magical books he had recovered from the Iranian treasury in Ceoria, writing down any interesting spell he could find and outright memorizing ones that looked particularly useful. Word analysis divinations, new combat spells, mind magic of the more structured kind. He had learned so many new spells he had trouble remembering them all. He was also steadily trying out new shaping exercises, writing down which ones were easiest to work with, which ones had a trick to doing them right and which ones became much easier if he did some other exercises before them. He was surprised how lacking the various exercise manuals were in regards to crucial information like that. By the time the restart was nearing its end, Zorian was ready for another attempt at the gate. He had adjusted his arsenal in light of what he had discovered about his opponents and thus had made 6 golems to bring along with him as support. He'd also captured several Ebusons during his trips to Seoria, trying to discover a method of passing through the gate without triggering the wards on Iasku Mansion. Sadly, none of them knew the answer to that particular mystery. He could only hope that the actual gate guards were better informed. Finally, he had tried to find out as much as he could about Sadamir Kondre without attracting too much attention. Since the secret master of Iasku Mansion was also the mayor of Nyazovtveri, he did that by teleporting to the town in question and started asking people questions and reading their minds while they talked. He found out that Sadamir had an excellent reputation among the people he governed. He was a capable administrator under whom the city grew a lot more rich and influential than it had previously been. He took full advantage of Aldamar's northern colonization drive to catapult the city to prominence, and then generously spread the wealth gained from that among the locals. He was known to be a rather secretive and private person, but very friendly and talkative when actually interacting with others. He was a powerful and talented mage, with a specialty in wards. His wife had died during the weeping, and he was hurt deeply by it, never bothering to remarry. Interestingly, Iasku Mansion wasn't as big of a secret as Zorian first imagined it to be. Quite a few people knew that Sadamir had some kind of secret hideout in the wilderness to the north, and that shady stuff happened there. However, most people thought that Sadamir's brand of shadiness involved smuggling of restricted merchandise and organizing drug-fueled orgies and whatnot. Basically, they thought he was connected to organized crime groups, not that he was animating corpses and betraying the country. On the day of the summer festival, Zorian went to Seoria and descended into the dungeon below the city to wait for the invasion to start. He couldn't find the group of hook goblins he had used previously. Him not being in Seoria and killing monsters with Taven had completely altered the distribution of monsters in the dungeon compared to the previous restart, so in the end he settled for a female tentacle-tailed scorpion. Mostly because she had hundreds of young, and they followed her lead in everything. If he ordered her to attack the Ebuson base, they would do the same, with no need for specific directions coming from him. Zorian slipped into the base while she and her brood distracted the defenders, much like he had last time. The golems, being much slower than him and very unstealthy, were ordered to stay behind while he went off to subdue the more disciplined mages and war trolls stationed around the gate itself. The war trolls were annoying. He needed the mages alive so he could interrogate them about the gate protections and the methods they used to summon Kutachichel, but anything that would disable them would also fail to work against the war trolls. After some thought, he simply set up incineration traps a fair distance away from the gate and then started using a combination of guidance spells and gas bombs to bombard the area around the gate from a fair distance away. He turned the entire area into a thick cloud of sleeping gas, probably wasting more than half of the bombs needlessly, but whatever. The important thing was that the mages all ended up incapacitated and the war trolls came running after him, screaming their heads off. They ran straight into the incineration traps, but rather than dying a horrible, fiery death, they survived the experience just fine. It took only a second for Zorian to realize what was happening. They weren't regular war trolls, no, these were the same sort of hyper-resilient ones that he and Taven had encountered in one of the previous restarts. The ones that shrugged off fire. He teleported away in time to avoid being crushed to a pulp by the huge iron masses the two trolls wielded, but it was a short-distance teleport and they were upon him again in a heartbeat. The resulting battle, which consisted mostly of Zorian teleporting around and throwing things at increasingly angry and injured war trolls, resulted in expenditure of nearly all of his prepared explosives and the destruction of 4 of his golems when he was forced to summon them as distractions halfway throughout the battle. Damn it. But at least he was alive and well, and the same could not be said of his opponents. The war trolls were eventually frozen solid by freezing rays, after which he shattered them into pieces just to be sure. Live and learn, next time he was using frost traps instead. Checking up on the rest of the Ebusons, he found them losing against the tentacle-tailed scorpions. They managed to wound the mother, but that only made her spawn go berserk with rage, and they surged forth with suicidal fury. The Ibisons scattered in front of them, and Zorian made sure to pick off anyone that looked like they were actually making a dent in the horde or trying to organize the defenders. With most of the threats neutralized, he went back to the gate and banished the cloud of sleeping gas that clung to the place so he could reach the mages he'd incapacitated. What he found from their minds was encouraging. First of all, the 4 he'd incapacitated were the only ones that knew how to contact Quatachichil. That was why the other defenders came to beg them for help in the previous restart. They weren't asking for permission to summon Quatachichil, they literally didn't know how to do it themselves. The method itself consisted of a simple sending spell, though one that required a particular keystone to actually reach the ancient lich. He had seen the keystone in question before, he realized. It was the teardrop-shaped amulet of polished black stone that high-ranking Ibisons always wore. He thought it was a purely ornamental thing to mark their station to other Ibisons, since it gave off no magic and had nothing whatsoever etched into its surface, but apparently he was wrong. Even now he could not figure out how it was supposed to work as a keystone, and he didn't dare analyze it too deeply, lest he trip some invisible tripwire and summon Quatachichil to his location. He didn't feel like receiving a disintegration beam to the face at the moment. Also, the way to enter the gate properly consisted of letting a high-ranking Ibison step through the gate first. This signaled to the wards in Iasku Mansion that everything was fine and everyone who entered after them is with them and thus also okay by association. Zorian did not know whether these specific Ibisons were keyed into the wards themselves or if the wards were detecting the presence of the keystone they all had on their person, and he didn't care. He simply pushed one of the unconscious Ibisons through the gate, amulet included, and stepped through afterwards. Just to be safe, he instructed his 2 surviving golems to immediately follow after him. He breathed a sigh of relief when the wards failed to react to his presence and the gate didn't close. Success. Let's see what I can find before Sadamir realizes he has an intruder in his home, Zorian mumbled to himself, stepping over the unconscious body of the Ibison he pushed through the gate. He motioned his 2 golem bodyguards to follow after him and then moved deeper into Iasku Mansion. Break. Considering it was one of the invasion points used to attack Sioria, Iasku Mansion was surprisingly empty. Now that he didn't have to dodge undead attackers all the time, Zorian had time to explore the interior and was baffled by how seemingly ordinary it was. It was an empty, but otherwise unexceptional mansion. He encountered neither traps nor undead until he tried to move towards the very center of the mansion, where he suspected Sadamir was located. At that point he crossed some invisible threshold and he felt the wards try to probe his soul and fail. A heavy feeling promptly settled down around him as the wards concentrated their energies around him. Knowing that the hordes of undead inside the place were making their way towards him and no longer caring about stealth, Zorian started testing the wards to see what exactly they did. He began by throwing one of his last remaining explosives in front of him and activating it to see if it would work. It did, but that didn't necessarily mean the adjustments he had made since last time were actually working. In the previous restart, his explosives had worked just fine at first, only to suddenly fail when he faced off against Sadamir. In all likelihood, the warding scheme only turned on its heaviest defenses when Sadamir commanded it to do so, and left them dormant otherwise to conserve mana. Trying to scry on the dimensional gate to see if it had closed when the wards turned on him failed. Nothing inside the house could be targeted by any of the divination spells he was aware of. Teleporting out didn't work, and connecting a recall tether to a stone cylinder and launching it through the window as far as it could go didn't allow him to recall himself out of the place either. The wards were also filling the entire mansion with a low-powered shaping disruption field, not enough to stop him from casting things, but definitely making his spellcasting take longer and require more concentration. He considered simply escaping outside through the windows, a surprisingly viable option, since they were very large and could be opened easily from the inside, but decided not to. Sadamir seemed pretty talkative in the previous restart, and now that Zorian knew he had a guaranteed way out, he wanted to see what would happen if he talked to the man. Maybe Sadamir was the sort of person who liked to gloat? It was stupid, but there were people like that. Over the next half an hour, Zorian fought against an endless stream of undead. Unlike last time, he was able to conserve his dispeller grenades and other items by relying on his golems to keep some of the animated corpses busy while he tackled the rest. He was sufficiently effective at whittling down the army of undead, in fact, that Sadamir eventually decided to withdraw his remaining forces rather than see them all destroyed. Or at least that's what Zorian assumed, since all of the undead boars and black-clad corpses turned and fled at some point. He did not expect that. He wondered whether Sadamir would even show up without Zorian being completely exhausted by his minions. Sadamir was clearly watching him, either through divinations or via some spying function embedded into the wards, so he surely knew Zorian was still dangerous to approach. Shrugging, Zorian started analyzing the wards with the help of the ward analysis device he took from the Iranian treasury. If Sadamir decided to stay away, that just meant he could deconstruct his warding scheme at his leisure, and that was still a win in his book. Like he suspected, the wards did not like him trying to figure them out. If he hadn't already outed himself as an intruder, he was certain that his current attempt at analysis would have branded him as such immediately. Zorian expected as much, that was why he hadn't tried that the moment he stepped through the dimensional gate. What he didn't expect was for the wards to actively fight back against his analysis. The shifting of the local ward fields around him and the repeated disrupting pulses directed his way were disturbingly adaptive, too intelligently used to come from a mindless spell construct. Was Sadamir somehow adjusting the warding scheme on the fly, or were the wards themselves somehow intelligent? The in front of him shimmered in a vaguely humanoid shape, and Zorian immediately fired a force lance at the spot. The shimmer was unaffected, though, and soon solidified into a ghostly image of a familiar man. A tall, older, muscular man, dressed in an expensive brown suit. He had a huge mustache and a smiling, sunny expression on his face. Zorian wasn't fooled, though. While Sadamir's illusionary projection tried to give off an air of happy indifference, his smile was noticeably more strained compared to how it was the last time he had seen him. "Hi there." Sadamir greeted him through his projection. "I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but this is a private residence. You can't just come in here and start tearing the place apart. What did I ever do to you, anyway? I'm surprised you're willing to show your face so openly, Sadamir Kondre," Zorian stated, scanning his surroundings to make sure Sadamir was not trying to distract him with his projection while setting up a surprise attack. "Ha! A mage of your caliber doesn't stumble into a place like this accidentally," Sadamir scoffed. "Your skills, your equipment. You already knew who and what was here, I'm sure. The interesting question is, who are you? It's only polite to introduce yourself to people, don't you know? Why did you help the Ibisans organize their attack on Seoria?" Zorian asked, not interested in giving any personal information to Sadamir and not really finding the man's antics amusing. "The death toll is in the thousands, and will only grow larger by the end. What did those people ever do to you, Sadamir?" "Ah. It's nothing personal, really," Sadamir shrugged, his smile dimming somewhat. "They are just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Politics can be brutal like that." "Politics?" asked Zorian incredulously. "They are trying to release a primordial rampage around the continent and you think that somehow in your political interest. I can understand how the Ibisans think this is a good thing for them, but what about you? Why would you want that to happen?" Sadamir stared at him for a second with a judging look on his face. "So you know about that too, huh?" he said, clacking his tongue in distaste. "Well, I don't think I feel comfortable discussing my goals with you, my dear home invader. However, just between you and me, I'd wager the Ibisans are too optimistic about this primordial's supposed danger level. It's going to do a lot of damage, I'm sure, but to imagine it running around the continent, destroying things at whim? Not a chance. I give it at best a week before Eldamar gathers enough troops to kill it. And that's assuming it's not just a dumb animal that will wander into the first trap they set for it. That's a very reckless attitude to have about the scenario," Zorian frowned. What if you're wrong? Nothing in life comes without risk, Sadamir said in a lecturing voice. Ugh. He was going nowhere with his conversation, and the man was blatantly stalling for time. He dispelled the projection with a wave of his hand and started walking towards the center of the mansion again, his two golem bodyguards walking in front of him. There was no point in trying to analyze the wards again, since he couldn't get through the weirdly intelligent safeguards Sadamir had put in place to prevent such things. Another ghostly projection shimmered into existence in front of him, but he dispelled it before it had a chance to speak. Now that's just rude. A disembodied voice echoed all around him. No more projection this time, just sound that followed him around wherever he went. We were having a conversation. There was a locked door in his way, so Zorian chucked one of his 3 remaining explosive cubes at it. It failed to work when he gave it a signal to explode. Sorry, but no explosions in my house, Sadamir's disembodied voice declared. Zorian frowned. Just like in the previous restart. And he had adjusted his explosive to try and counter the effect too. Worrying. By themselves, anti-explosion wards were nothing new. Every important building had them. Most of the time, though, they were just basic things that could not stand up to Zorian's craftsmanship. Sadamir's wards could not only counter his basic explosives, but also his specialized work that was expressly designed to work inside a heavily warded area. His hand instinctively grasped one of the explosive rings he carried around his neck. His old suicide method, which he opted to still carry around just in case. He quickly took off one of the rings and threw it at the door, wanting to see if they would work. The suicide rings were his most sophisticated work, after all, designed to work no matter what the circumstances. The ring failed to blow up. Maybe the wards worked on some exotic principle that totally shut down all spell formula-based explosives? To test that theory, he threw a bottle of liquid explosive, alchemically made and devoid of any fancy spellwork, at the door in question. The bottle exploded as intended, sending dust and wooden splinters everywhere. So alchemy-based explosives still work. Good to know. Just how many expendables did you bring with you? Sadamir asked him through his voice spell. It must have cost a fortune. I'm flattered that you spent all that money on little old me, but is that really the best use of your resources? After that, the remaining undead in the mansion started attacking him again, trying to ambush him from nearby rooms as he tried to navigate the confusing inner layout of the mansion. They failed to actually hurt him, but they slowed his advance to a crawl and ended up being enough in the end. He literally ran out of time. The restart ended before he could track down Sadamir and confront him. Oh well, there was always next time. Break. The next restart was largely similar to the previous one. He still contacted Deep Blue and the Luminous Advocates for mind magic instructions and largely spent the entire restart working on his mind magic. He did make a minor deviation at the start of the restart in order to visit the Ghost Serpent Acolytes, though. They told him the exact same thing they had in the previous restart. The Ghost Serpent says he's bad news and that he should go away. Trying to find out why he was bad news yielded no results. The spirit the web in question worshipped refused to say what about him was bad news. The very knowledge of what sort of bad news he was in itself bad news. He was the worst news. Bizarre. Well, disliking someone for no reason was no crime and, short of attacking the Ghost Serpent Acolytes, there was nothing Zorian could do about the situation. And if he attacked them, then he was kind of vindicating the asshole spirit in a way, wasn't he? His lessons with the Luminous Advocates progressed at a rapid pace. By the end of the restart, he was ready to attempt to repair the Matriarch's memory packet. It worked. Sort of. The packet wasn't exactly fixed, but he'd halted the degradation and bought himself another 2 months before it would start to decay again. That, the Luminous Advocates informed him, was the only thing that could really be done about a decaying foreign memory packet. You manually stitch it together and it would hold for a time, but that process was in itself destructive to the packet, so there were only so many times one could repair it. Based on the size and condition of the Matriarch's memory packet, The Luminous advocates thought it could only be repaired one more time without risking its destruction. He had 2 more months to get better at memory packet repairs, after which he would get one more chance to buy some time. That meant that, depending on how good the second round of repairs went, he had about 4 or 5 more restarts at most to get good enough at interpreting Iranian memories to read the memories stored in the packet. He decided he had to get some experience with reading Iranian memories. Actually reading Iranian memories, not doing simplified exercises with Iranian tutors. Of course, neither the Luminous advocates nor Deep Blue would agree to work with him on that, and he would bet that no other web could be talked into it either. No, that sort of thing was virtually always a hostile act, something you do to your enemies. So the solution was simple. He had to find some Iranian enemies. His first idea was to go after the sword divers. After all, they did try to ambush him once, and he still held a grudge about that, even if they didn't remember any of it. It even worked for a time. He managed to ambush several sword diver patrols and captured them for memory reading. His first 2 attempts to read the Iranian mind ended up about as well as his first attempt at reading human minds. That is, not well at all. He improved quickly, however, and soon found out some interesting things about sword divers. They had a habit of attacking vulnerable mages. It turned out, they limited themselves to mages that tried to explore the dungeon beneath Corsa, and they were very careful about whom they targeted, but they were definitely willing to attack anyone they saw as an easy target. They also lived very deep in the dungeon, and any time they made the wrong person disappear, they just retreated from the surface layers until the searches and outrage died down. And that is what the sword divers did when they realized someone was targeting them. They flat out abandoned the dungeon beneath Corsa, retreating into the depths. Having read their minds, Zorian knew it would be weeks, perhaps months before they deigned to return, and he didn't dare follow after them. So he just looted their surface money stashes more out of spite than because he really needed the cash and went searching for more targets. He asked both Deep Blue and the Luminous advocates if they knew an Iranian web they wouldn't mind being targeted. Surprisingly, it was the Luminous advocates that were more interested. He expected Deep Blue to jump at the chance, considering their neighborhood, but they were actually pretty content with their current situation. They did offer him a job, however. One that they claimed would buy him pretty much anything he wanted out of them. Basically, they wanted him to get rid of the crystal ooze that was harassing their resource-gathering expeditions into the deeper parts of the dungeon. Crystal oozes were virtually immune to physical damage, quite fast, absorbed most forms of magical energy, could shoot arrow-like shards of crystal at things that annoyed them, and even a tiny prickle from one of their crystal blades and shards would rapidly turn a living being into a crystal statue. They were sometimes called crystal basilisks, and they were one of those nightmare monsters that nobody actually wanted to fight unless there was no choice. Deep Blue didn't seem very surprised when he declined their offer. As for the Luminous advocates, they were apparently under constant threat from a web they called the Demon Skin Web or the Howling Ones. Those weren't their real names, but since that particular web refused to talk to any of the other ones and simply did the telepathic equivalent of screaming whenever someone tried to talk to them, the Luminous advocates didn't know what to call them. The Luminous advocates indicated they wouldn't mind to see them gone, or at least thinned out a bit. Well, by the end of the restart, Zorian had found out a lot of things about them. Such as that they called themselves Challengers of the Unspeakable, and were the so-called Old Aranya, the Magicles, original webs that got conquered, assimilated or exterminated by the newer, magic-using webs originating from underneath Syria. They had watched all their old neighbors fall before the tide of magic-using newcomers, either through violent conquest or through magic-using immigrants, until they were the only ones left. As far as they were concerned, it was the Luminous advocates who were the Demon Skin Web. Tragic, but Challengers of the Unspeakable were also violent killers that actively raided their neighbors, and even nearby human communities when they could get away with it. Zorian had no qualms about raiding them back. Finally, as the end of the restart approached, he started finalizing his preparations for another gate assault. This time his Golem Brigade would hopefully survive long enough to actually step into Iascu Mansion along with him, giving him solid superiority over Sadamir's undead guards. As they say, third time's the charm. Chapter 048 Well of Souls. Far away from any established path or settlement, in a small artificial cave that Zorian had made to serve as his workshop and base of operations, there was a large wooden table. A mass of papers was strewn over it, and Zorian was staring at it with a small frown. The collection of scribbled notes and crude diagrams in front of him would no doubt look like a haphazard mess to the casual observer, but there was a pattern to the chaos. Zorian had spent a fair amount of time assembling the entire thing, and each piece of paper was exactly where he wanted it to be. Absent-mindedly tapping his pencil on the table, Zorian considered the information laid out in front of him. Everything he knew about Sadamir and Iasku Mansion was there on the table, along with any other information he thought might be relevant for the upcoming gate assault. Truthfully, he already had a plan for the event. But it never hurt to double-check things, just in case he had forgotten something crucial. There were only 3 more days left until the summer festival, so if he wanted to make any significant changes to the plan, this was pretty much his last chance to do so. After his conversation with Sadamir in the previous restart, Zorian was now fairly sure that the man had his own goals he wanted to accomplish, and was effectively a third faction of the invasion force. He was not just being a loyal member of the cult of the World Dragon or sympathetic to the Ebisons. He was hoping to gain something out of his endeavor, and it wasn't the same thing that the other 2 factions were fighting for. Sadly, he had been unable to figure out what Sadamir had been alluding to when he said he supported the invasion because of politics. That could mean anything, really. There was no shortage of reasons why someone might want Sioria gunned or taken down a peg. Sadamir might be trying to alter the internal balance of power within Eldamar to advance his pet cause, or trying to destroy Sioria's regional importance to boost the power of his own town and domain. He might be trying to weaken Eldamar as a whole on behalf of foreign interests, or he might simply want to distract the central government by destroying a major loyalist stronghold and giving them an external enemy to focus on. The possibilities were endless, and he had no way to narrow things down. Well, no way besides repeatedly invading Iasku Mansion or attacking Sadamir directly. The former he was already doing, and the latter was hard to pull off. It was too easy for Sadamir to teleport away if Zorian decided to attack him on the job, and Zorian didn't know where the man went when not attending to his duties. Certainly not to his home in Yazov Vary, which was virtually abandoned most of the time. Knowing Zorian's luck, Sadamir was probably spending most of his time safely ensconced in Iasku Mansion, which was essentially unassailable before the day of the invasion. No, his current way of going about things was definitely the correct one. Sadamir was never as vulnerable as he was on the day of the invasion, and not just because he foolishly sent virtually all of his forces to join the invasion and then left the obvious hole in his defenses completely unguarded. Iasku Mansion was obviously more than just a secret base for Sadamir, otherwise he would have been far more willing to cut his losses and run in the previous restart. There was something there, something he was unwilling to abandon, even after being metaphorically caught with his pants down and steadily backed into a corner. Zorian had a feeling that if he could find this mysterious something, he would solve the mystery of what Sadamir's real goals were easily enough. He spent several more minutes poring over the papers in front of him, considering and discarding various possibilities, before his eyes fell on the small cluster of notes dealing with Iasku Mansion's warding scheme. His frown immediately deepened. Those wards worried him. His research told him there were several methods that Sadamir could have used to achieve the sort of reaction Zorian had experienced when he had tried to analyze the wards, but in all honesty, the most likely answer was that Sadamir had bound souls into the mansion's warding scheme. It seemed fairly obvious, considering Sadamir was clearly very necromancy-focused, and it would explain the weird ominous feelings he kept getting whenever the wards recognized him as an enemy. Most wards weren't so obvious about targeting someone. Another point in favor of such a theory was that Iasku Mansion wasn't situated on a Mana-well, as far as Zorian could tell. He had spent several days wandering around the area where Iasku Mansion was located, mapping the local geomantic web and dodging winter vault patrols, and he had found no evidence of a convenient underground ley line that could be tapped into. In other words, Yasku Mansion couldn't possibly support a warding scheme of any appreciable power. Not with conventional methods, anyway. Souls though. Souls continued producing mana, even after death. It was what made them so valuable to spiritual entities like demons, and was one of the reasons why undead were so much more convenient to use than golems. It would take a lot of souls to power the sort of wards that Yasku Mansion sported, but it could be done. And Sadamir clearly had no problems getting souls, considering how many undead guards he had at his disposal. Unfortunately, the illegal nature of soul magic made it difficult to gather solid information on its limitations and peculiarities. Even if he really was dealing with a creepy soul-powered house, Zorian had no idea what that meant for Sadamir's capabilities or how to exploit it. Coupled with the fact that Sadamir no doubt had some kind of last resort defense set up at the heart of his domain, and Zorian was feeling just a little bit uneasy about blithely working in there without knowing more about what he was dealing with. Fortunately, he was a mage. He had a way of having his cake and eating it too. The basic idea came from seeing Sadamir's projection. Zorian couldn't really project himself through the mansion like that, since the wards would stop him, but he could pilot his golem army remotely. That would be very impractical for most mages, but he was a telepath, and a pretty damn good one at this point. All he had to do was install a bunch of telepathic relays into each golem, along with some moderately complex spell formula work to make them understand his telepathic commands. It worked well. No, it worked better than well. Maybe it was because he had animated the golems himself, and they thus had affinity to his own thoughts, but ordering them around telepathically was very fast and smooth, almost like controlling additional bodies. He could never achieve that sort of precision and coordination with verbal commands, and Zorian was wondering if there was any point in even bothering with conventional control methods in the future. Unless he was designing golems for someone else's use, verbal commands were only useful as a backup method for times when his telepathy was being disrupted. Unfortunately, there were some problems with his idea of simply throwing his golems at Sadamir and orchestrating things from relative safety. For one thing, the fact that he wasn't there personally meant he would be unable to use any magic to help them out. There was no way to cast spells remotely through his puppets. Even his mind magic didn't extend beyond the golems themselves. He also wouldn't be able to activate his dispeller grenades and other spell items with mana pulses, which had necessitated a complete redesign of his arsenal into something cruder and less versatile. Finally, there was a fairly major issue of Sadamir seeing through his setup and disrupting his control over the golems. According to the books, that was the major reason why remote control schemes weren't more popular among mages. They were too easy to disrupt if the opponent knew what he was doing. Hopefully his solution to that problem would work. Come to think of it, he should probably check up on that now. Dropping his pen on the table with a small sigh, Zorian left the planning room, as he had dubbed it, and went to the crafting chamber where he assembled his golems and other equipment. Most of the golems were already done at this point, silently standing at the far end of the room where they wouldn't be in the way, awaiting orders. 6 golems, 2 of them big and bulky to soak up damage, and 4 smaller and faster ones to serve as a backbone of his little force. He extended his mind to them momentarily, testing their responsiveness to see if the control interface had degraded since their last test. It hadn't. Good. The first dozen or so versions had been very unstable, but it seemed he had ironed out all the flaws in the latest batch. He turned his attention to the reason he came here. His last, currently unfinished creation. It didn't look like much, in all honesty. Thin, almost skeletal, and yet smaller than even his 4 agility-focused combat golems. The animation core that powered it was likewise underwhelming. The golem in question couldn't do anything without constant, detailed instruction. It would be useless for just about any purpose. Except, hopefully, for the one that Zorian designed it for. Namely, for being his body double. The golem was specifically designed to mimic his size and proportions, with an animation core meant to synchronize with his telepathic orders as smoothly as possible. Magical sensors allowed Zorian to see and hear through it as through his own senses, and while he couldn't achieve the same amount of hand-eye coordination while using it as he could with his own body, it should be enough to throw around grenades and walk around well enough to pass as a human being. He glanced at the nearby alchemical container, where a syrupy pink liquid bubbled softly upon a carefully regulated fire. The artificial skin solution looked pretty much done to his eyes, but the recipe he had bought claimed the whole thing needed to simmer for at least another 15 minutes, so he left it alone for the moment, putting the golems through another round of tests to pass the time. Finally, once the 15 minutes had passed, he dumped the artificial skin solution over the golem and quickly started molding it into something resembling himself before it solidified and became unmodifiable. Half an hour later, he stood back to inspect his handiwork. It was kind of bad. The golem didn't really look like him much, or even entirely human, despite his best efforts. Either he sucked even more as a sculptor than he'd thought he did, or he should have taken the solution off the fire sooner, recipe be damned. But it was adequate, really. Some strategic goggles, heavy clothing and maybe a large hat should be enough to hide the imperfections. It should look human enough to fool Sadamir, at least until he could face off with the necromancer in person, at which point the man's soul sight would allow him to see through any amount of disguise anyway. Hard to hide that the golem has no soul, after all. Oh well, even if the idea turned out to have been stupid and unnecessary in the end, he regretted nothing. He'd always wanted to make a body double of himself to offload some of his more annoying duties onto, and this seemed like a step in the right direction. Animation spells could get scarily intelligent at the highest levels of sophistication, so it should be possible to design a look-alike golem that could pass casual inspection and pose as him. Looking at the misshapen thing in front of him, though, Zorian knew he was quite far from being able to create something like that. He'd never be able to skip family gatherings with this. By now, the gate assault had become something of a routine for Zorian. He dealt with the Ebeson defenders virtually flawlessly, the only complication being that the pair of cave drakes he'd used as a distraction had fallen a little too quickly for Zorian's liking. They were big and tough, but apparently hordes of weaker opponents were a better choice for keeping the defenders busy until he could secure the gate. Still, all of his golems had survived the attack on the Ebeson base, and most of his spell item stockpile was still unspent, so Zorian considered the first phase of the attack a success. With the gate secure, the real operation could begin. He pushed the unconscious body of one of the Ebesons through the gate to fool the mansion's wards into thinking the incursion was authorized and then stepped through, his golem battle group trailing behind him. The plan was simple. Zorian would remain in the gate room, guarded by one of the big golems, while the rest of his force would be sent deeper into the mansion to confront Sadamir. Zorian would be essentially projecting himself through the smallest, most human-looking golem, occasionally giving the rest of the golems superfluous verbal commands to complete the illusion. Hopefully this would fool Sadamir into thinking he was dealing with two human invaders, one of whom was just guarding the gate while the other one led a force of golems deeper into his domain, rather than just one human that was directing the golems remotely. Not only should it keep Sadamir from trying to disrupt Zorian's remote control, it should also keep Sadamir's attention firmly on the advancing golems and reduce the chance of him sending his forces around to strike at real Zorian. The first surprise came when his golems had reached the spot where the wards had turned on him in the previous restart. This time they didn't activate. Strange. After thinking about it for a while, Zorian decided it was probably because none of the golems had souls. The detection wards were probably soul-based, just like everything else in this house. Sadly, that only delayed the problem, as he soon encountered a locked door he had to go through to keep advancing. The golem Zorian was puppeteering didn't have anything to pick the lock with, and even if it had, it lacked the manual dexterity to perform something as finicky as lockpicking. So he just ordered the big golem to smash the door aside. Unsurprisingly, that proved too much for the wards to ignore, and they immediately turned hostile. Zorian ordered the golem group forward, trying to get them as close to the mansion's center as possible before Sadamir scrambled his undead forces and tried to intercept them. Curiously, the dimensional gate stayed open, despite the activation of the wards. Zorian could feel the ward's agitation as they realized he was a threat and intensified around him, but even though he triggered the wards in such a brazen manner, even though he was right there in the gate room, the dimensional opening refused to close shut. Obviously triggering the wards outside the actual gate room sidestepped the automatic shutdown contingency, but that sounded like such a silly oversight that Zorian couldn't help but think Sadamir wanted things to work like that. Surely a warding expert like Sadamir wouldn't make that sort of mistake? And even if he did, he almost certainly had a way to shut down the gate on his own initiative, independent of any automatic shutdown. What was he missing here? Why would Sadamir want the gate to remain open, even if he had intruders inside his mansion? Well, whatever. Only one way to find out. The golems pressed onwards, even as the first waves of undead began to crash into them. Zorian had plenty of spell items to burn this time, so he used them quite liberally on the attackers to great effect. His advance was steady and unstoppable, and the attacks on his golem group became increasingly frantic and disorganized as time went by. Sadamir hadn't even tried to contact him, in person or via projection. There were far less traps than Zorian expected there would be, though in retrospect it made a lot of sense that Sadamir wouldn't seed his corridors with explosives and other destructive effects. Nobody wanted their possessions trashed by their own defenses, and the mansion was usually filled to the brim with guards anyway. When Zorian did finally encounter a real trap, it came in the form of a gas trap that rapidly filled an entire hallway with thick, yellow smoke. Considering that the gas had no effect on his golems and that the activation of the trap was soon followed by one last attack by the mansion's undead defenders, Zorian guessed that the gas was poisonous. It was a pretty good way to debilitate unprepared living foes while leaving the undead boars and warriors unaffected. The smoke also reduced visibility for anyone relying on regular sight, while the undead didn't seem affected by the resulting visibility issues. Sadamir had clearly put in his all into this one last attack, even sending a pair of flesh golems to reinforce the more familiar boars and black-clad human corpses. The flesh golems managed to destroy two of his smaller golems before being torn apart, but the result was never really in doubt. The undead were destroyed and Zorian broke through the last door standing between him and his destination. The golem he was puppeteering stepped into the heart of Iasqua Mansion, and the sight honestly left Zorian speechless. The room was large and cylindrical, with every inch of the walls covered with spell formula glyphs. Rather than being simply etched or painted on, however, the glyphs were made out of a shiny, silvery metal embedded into the walls. The really eye-catching thing, though, was the massive crystalline cylinder placed into the exact center of the room. It stretched from floor to ceiling, affixed to them via stone bases and thick metal bands, and emanated a soft blue glow that glimmed and brightened in a slow, regular pattern. Like a gigantic, glowing, cylindrical heart. Zorian stared at the glowing pillar in the glyph-covered wall in silence, wondering what the hell he'd stepped into. He had expected to find something interesting here, yes, but the sheer scale of the thing in front of him was rather intimidating. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Sadamir said, stepping from behind the pillar. "It took me years to build all of this. It's a work of love, and I'd really hate to see it damaged. So be a little careful with those explosives you're toting around here, okay?" Zorian frowned at the man in front of him. Sadamir was just standing there, smiling at him cockily. It was as if he was daring Zorian to attack him. For a moment, he debated simply ordering his golems to surge forwards and crush Sadamir into paste, but he decided to hold back for the moment. He wanted to see if he could get something out of the man first. "The cylinder is a soul storage device, isn't it?" Zorian spoke through the golem. "That's how you're powering the wards in this place. There must be hundreds of souls trapped there." "A soul storage device?" Sadamir repeated, sounding quite outraged. His left hand twitched uncontrollably for a second before Sadamir used his other hand to still its movements. "You think all of this is just?" He burst into laughter, like he'd just heard a very amusing joke. Was it just Zorian, or did Sadamir sound just a little bit unhinged this time? "My dear, foolish, uninvited guest. You have no idea what you have stumbled upon here, do you? Look around you," said Sadamir, making a sweeping gesture with his hands to indicate at the room they were standing in. "Do you really think this place is just a simple soul storage device? No, my friend, what you're looking at is a veritable well of souls containing thousands of spiritual essences, and with enough room for 1,000,000 more." "A million souls?" Zorian asked incredulously. "Come on now, Sadamir. How would you even gather that many souls in a timely manner?" "Sioria has almost 500,000 people," Sadamir said, shrugging lightly. "If the attack on Sioria goes as planned, most of them are going to die tonight. They will then go here to join the ones I've already gathered." He knocked on the crystal pillar lightly for emphasis. "What?" asked Zorian, a horrifying realization dawning on him. "Oh yes. This place?" began Sadamir, spinning in place with his hands outstretched. "This is the equivalent of an Antlian pit for souls. Everyone who dies in the vicinity of Yaskwa Mansion has their soul drawn here and trapped in the well. Normally, that doesn't mean much, since we're in the middle of nowhere. But now—" "The gate," Zorian said. "It allows you to extend your soul trap over the city while the Ebisons go about killing people. That's why you haven't closed the gate, even after you realized you were under attack. Every moment that the gate spends closed is a moment during which souls are not flowing into the well," Sadamir said. "And, you see, there were no more attackers pouring in by the time I noticed the intrusion. Only you two. Or perhaps just one? I can't see a soul on you. You didn't react at all when I flooded the corridor with breath-stealer gas, either. Not to mention how suspiciously passive the mage next to the gate is. You're some kind of fancy projection, aren't you?" Before Zorian could say anything, Sadamir started laughing again, loudly and hysterically, his hands twitching and clenching in a disturbing manner. Zorian was pretty sure at this point that there was something very wrong with Sadamir. He had triggered some pretty radical change in the necromancer with his successful invasion. The laughter, the twitching, the unusual candidness of his responses. Sadamir looked almost drugged. Did he panic in the face of the crisis and take some ill-advised enhancement potion? Or maybe perform some spell with severe side effects? Whatever the answer, Sadamir was steadily becoming more unstable as the conversation progressed, and Zorian didn't think he would get much more out of him. "Why? Why?" Sadamir screamed suddenly, instantly transitioning from laughter to overdramatic despair. His skin writhed like snakes were swimming through his flesh and his eyes began to shine with a soft blue glow. Yup, he had definitely panicked and done something stupid. "Why did you come here? Everything was going so well, so perfectly. All those years of planning, all the sacrifices I made. I won't let you take it all away from me. I won't. Zorian ordered his golems to attack the man, but he had made his move far too late. Before the golems could reach him, Sadamir's body rapidly expanded and twisted, transforming into a huge humanoid monster. It was green, vaguely reptilian, and had small, vestigial wings growing out of its back, like a cross between a troll and dragon. The golems he had ordered to attack Sadamir kept charging at their target, undaunted by the transformation, but the creature was stronger and more agile than Zorian's creations. It probably was part troll, too, because it definitely regenerated like one when wounded. It did not take long for the smaller golems to be reduced to scrap, and the big golem wasn't doing so well either. Zorian was just about to hit it with every spell item he had left when he found out that the troll dragon thing could breathe fire too. The poor golem he was following didn't last a second under the heat before failing. The big golem disappeared from his control less than a minute later. Knowing that he had no chance against this transformed, berserk version of Sadamir, Zorian stepped back into the Ebison base on the other side of the dimensional gate and then tried to analyze the gate to see how it worked. Predictably, the gate soon detected his tampering and shut itself down. Of course. He kind of figured that would happen. Well, at least that way Sadamir couldn't get to him, and he'd also located one of the traps Quatachichil had placed on the gate to prevent tampering with it. It would take a fair number of restarts, but he felt he could locate and dismantle the protection on the gate with a bit of trial and error. He didn't have much time to consider things, though, because Kotachichil showed up soon after the gate closed to see what was happening. Zorian activated his restart switch rather than confront him. Break. At the start of the next restart, once he had a chance to calm down and think about things, Zorian decided that Sadamir had to be dealt with somehow. Originally he'd gone after the man because he had seemed like an easier target than the Ibisan leaders and probably knew a lot of their sensitive secrets, but the revelation about his soul-gathering operation really disturbed Zorian. He had no idea what one would need hundreds of thousands of souls for, but it couldn't possibly be good. Politics, he'd said. HMPH. Still, this soul trap of his. It should be very obvious to someone who knew what to look for. Large-scale magic like that couldn't be hidden easily. Was that why Sadamir had gotten rid of every soul mage in the region? So they couldn't stumble upon his twisted masterpiece and report him to the government? If so, then dealing with Sadamir might simply be a matter of reporting the man to central authorities and having them deal with everything. He didn't need this kind of distraction at the moment, though. The matriarch's memory package was steadily degrading and he was running out of time. Thus, for the next 2 restarts he continued doing what he had been doing thus far, visiting Iranian webs in order to learn more about memory packets and the Iranian mind. He still made 2 gate assaults at the end of each restart, but he no longer tried to access the soul well in the center of the mansion. He didn't see the point, he completely lacked the expertise to make sense of that thing, so he doubted he would learn anything from studying it. Instead, he simply explored the rest of the mansion, building a map of the place and trying to see if there was anything else interesting about it. He didn't find much, though. Certainly nothing that could compare with the soul trap in the central room. He also tried to make sense of the teardrop pendants the Ibisans wore around their necks, also without much luck. Analyzing them did not bring down Kotachichil's wrath on him like he had feared, but there was nothing there to indicate he was holding a functional keystone. The only thing he could think of was that the material itself was perhaps the key. Zorian couldn't identify it, and it was totally indestructible to casual efforts. It kind of reminded him of Kotachichil's skeleton, which was also black in color and incredibly resistant to damage. Although the luminous advocates remained his primary Iranian teachers in these 2 restarts, he also checked out the 8 webs he was referred to by the Silent Doorway adepts. Sadly, only 3 of those were in any way useful to him: the Mind Temple, Perfect Phantasm Crafters and Adherents of Contemplation. Zorian chose to learn from the Mind Temple in the first restart and the Perfect Phantasm Crafters in the second one. The Adherents of Contemplation were too fond of riddles and non-answers for his taste. The Mind Temple were all about memory, though more focused on honing and organizing their own memories than reading and modifying other people's ones. Still, they had quite a lot of expertise when it came to memory packets, even if what they taught him was centered more about him making his own memory packets than repairing foreign ones. His skills at making memory packets were good enough by now that he would never really forget anything he specifically tried to remember. If nothing else, that should drastically reduce the number of notebooks he had to write and store at the end of each restart. The alteration method was still useful for transferring other people's notes across the restart, such as Kale's research, but most of his own needs were now better served by directly organizing his memories with mind magic. The Perfect Phantasm Crafters had a very indicative name. They specialized in making illusions, ones made out of real sound and light, as well as simple tricks of the mind. They couldn't really help him with his memory package problem, but Zorian would also have to actually interpret the information inside the package once he opened it, and Perfect Phantasm Crafters knew a lot about the difference between human and Iranian minds. They had to, if they wanted their illusions to work on humans. However, as helpful as the Perfect Phantasm Crafters were in that regard, there was ultimately only one thing that consistently helped him to understand Iranian thoughts: beating up Iranian unconscious and forcibly rooting through their minds. Even getting Lekave to make him an Irania transformation potion and assuming their shape for a few hours hadn't helped him as much. At the end of the second restart, he tried repairing the Matriarch's memory package again. It was the last time he would be able to extend the deadline, and he was hoping to get 4 or 5 extra months before he had to open it. Instead, he got 3. Damn it. Break. Though he had only 3 more months until he had to open the matriarch's memory packet, Zorian decided to stop seeking lessons from the Aranya and simply go back to Seoria, taking Cariel with him as usual. There was no point in seeking the lessons at the moment, since he could no longer repair the packet, and the only thing that could really improve his ability to understand it was attacking Aranya and reading their minds. He didn't need to set aside an entire restart to do that. Besides, he wanted to ask Kale about his opinion of Sadamir and his operations, since the Morlock was the only friendly necromancer that Zorian knew. He didn't tell Kale about Sadamir and his soul trap immediately, though, that was bound to be rather upsetting to the boy, considering that a lot of Kale's friends and acquaintances were killed by Sadamir and probably ended up in that soul well of his. Not really the best topic to broach just after you told someone all about the time loop and the Ebeson invasion that was going to hit the city in less than a month. He would let Kale browse through his notebooks in peace for now and broach the subject later. Unfortunately, coming back to Seoria meant that he had to suffer through Xvim's stupid exercise sessions again. Levitate these marbles, make them glow different colors, assemble them into different shapes. So boring. Wait. Fuse 2 marbles together. What? Xvim usually didn't give him any alteration-based shaping exercises during these sessions. But no matter, he had already tried that shaping exercise on his own, so it was still trivial to perform it. Xvim frowned at him. Should he be worried or celebrate that he induced that kind of reaction out in the usually imperturbed Babylon? Worried, it turned out. Xvim's demands immediately became atypical following that. Zorian was told to levitate water, to freeze it solid, to make a perfect cube out of ice and then quickly cut it in half without shattering it, to reshape a coin, to burn images into wooden panels, to make a coin spin, to shape candle wax, to hold his hand over a candle flame without getting burned, to make dice fall on one specific side Xvim called out, to repair a damaged watch, to wilt a flower, to teleport a snail. Quite a few exercises were utterly beyond Zorian, especially the latter ones. Others he could do, but not with the surety that he knew Xvim demanded of his charges. And yet, Xvim did not triumphantly stop once he found something that Zorian was incapable of and then tell him to practice that until he got it right. Instead he just moved on to something else, apparently just testing him to see where his limits were. Tell me honestly, Xvim said. Are you truly Zorian Kaczynski? Yes? Zorian said, baffled. Why would you ask that? You were too good, Xvim told him bluntly. What? Now he decided he was too good at this? Bizarre. What did he do to perturb Xvim so much? He couldn't really remember doing anything more impressive than usual. I'll take that as a compliment, Zorian said. I am definitely Zorian Kaczynski, though, no doubt about it. Then how do you explain your shaping skills? Xvim asked. They are completely implausible for your age and known background. No matter how talented you may be, your shaping skills are just too thorough to be anything but a product of years of practice. I started early, Zorian tried. Xvim gave him an unamused look. I'm going to be perfectly honest with you, Mr. Kaczynski, Xvim said with a sigh. I know it was me who taught you those shaping skills you are currently displaying. Not all of them, but definitely the ones that you have learned properly. Not only do you display some tells that I don't think anyone other than me would have taught you, but you also seem to know me well enough to anticipate my requests before I even speak them. Oops. He hadn't even realized he'd been doing that. The thing is, Mr. Kaczynski, said Xvim, leaning forward and fixing him with a small glare, I don't remember ever teaching you. And I assure you that I have a very good memory. I would like an explanation, if you don't mind. Zorian was silent for nearly a minute, thinking of how to answer that. He could just play dumb, but he had a feeling that Xvim wouldn't let this go, and the most likely explanation for the confusion was that Zorian had used mind magic on Xvim in the past. Considering that he was, in fact, a highly capable mind mage, and that this would be hard to hide under determined scrutiny. It was in his best interest not to let things degenerate into actual legal investigation. He could just hit the restart switch and start over, but that felt a little excessive at this point. He could always do that later if the situation continued to deteriorate. Plus, activating the switch so early in the restart might bring unwanted attention from Zack and Red Robe. Would it be so bad if he told Xvim the truth? The man knew how to protect his mind, and probably wouldn't go around telling everyone who would listen that his student claimed he was a time traveler. As much as Xvim annoyed him, he was a capable adult mage that clearly knew a lot about limitations of magic and how to go about developing it. He could be quite useful if he could convince him he was telling the truth. "I'm waiting, Mr. Kaczynski," Xvim said. "All right," Zorian relented. "The truth is that we're all trapped in a time loop of sorts. The whole month leading up to the summer festival repeats itself endlessly, but most people forget everything that happened when time resets itself. But some people remember, and I am one of them." Xvim listened to Zorian's story in silence, neither asking questions nor professing disbelief. Zorian didn't tell the man everything, of course. He said nothing about the invasion that happened at the end of the restart, for instance, and he kept information about himself and his abilities to a minimum. Definitely not telling the man who suspected him of messing with his mind that he was more than capable of doing just that. Eventually, Zorian's explanation wound down and silence descended upon the room. Xvim seemed to be lost in thought for the moment, and Zorian was content to wait for the man's reaction. "So," Xvim said eventually, "you were saying that we have been having these practice sessions for several years now, except that I forget all about them every few weeks." "Yes," Zorian confirmed. "That must have been a miserable experience for you, then," Xvim observed candidly. Zorian fumbled, unsure how to respond to that. "I am still not sure whether to believe you about all this," Xvim said. "It seems quite unbelievable. However, assuming you are indeed telling the truth, I feel compelled to apologize for the actions of my previous selves. You see, I make it a point to be very demanding with my charges for the first month or two of our mentorship." "What? What?" Zorian asked incredulously, scarcely believing what he was hearing. "It builds character and weeds out the unfit," said Xvim, giving him an unrepentant shrug. "Moreover, most of the students being sent my way need to be humbled somewhat, for their own good. Unfortunately, a time loop does not play well with such ploys. I wouldn't have put you through several years of that kind of treatment if I had any control over the situation." Zorian was torn between wanting to laugh and slugging the man in the face. He subjected every student to several months of being an utter jerk as a test of character? That was so stupid. How could he possibly think that was a reasonable thing to do? "I cannot possibly put into words how much I want to hit you right now," he told Xvim seriously. "We'll talk about expanding your vocabulary later," Xvim told him dismissively, before depositing a pen and a piece of paper in front of him. "For now, please list a few things I can check to confirm your story." Shooting Xvim one last glare, Zorian picked up the pen and started writing. This was going to be one long restart, he could already tell. Tope continued,